As has been demonstrated throughout the scores, especially on modules 8, 9, and 10, which dealt with effects rising global mean temperatures have on water and food resources and rising sea levels, developing regions or countries are most vulnerable to climate change driven by human-induced greenhouse gas emissions, especially CO2, carbon dioxide. However, equally as provocative is the fact that developed countries or regions are responsible for much of these emissions. The United States of America is one of these countries, being the second largest emitter of CO2 after China. It is worth noting, however, that according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, CO2 emissions decreased significantly in 2020 due to restrictions from COVID-19, which impacted fossil fuel emissions from transportation and energy generation. Nevertheless, the global mean temperature is expected to rise to 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit or 2 degrees Celsius under business as usual scenarios. This means increased heat waves, water shortage, and hazardous precipitation events that affect vulnerable regions even within developed nations such as the US. So what is being done to mitigate these outcomes and reduce emissions? One state is arguably becoming one of the greatest national leaders in cutting greenhouse gas emissions in the US, and that is Washington State. A series of legislated emissions restrictions are being pioneered by Governor Jay Inslee. These include the Zero Emissions Vehicle Standard, which requires automakers to deliver a certain number of zero emissions vehicles each year. On the energy side of things, the Clean Energy Transformation Act requires electric utilities to transition to carbon neutral by 2030 and carbon-free electricity by 2045. The Washington state government body has also passed legislation to reduce food waste, which is responsible for a lot of the nation's methane emissions, by 50% of the 2015 levels. Now, perhaps the boldest move towards reducing emissions that this state has undertaken is in the carbon tax. In 2018, it became the first state in the US to actively put forth a carbon tax to a vote. Carbon tax is essentially an attempted solution to the tragedy of the commons problem, which, as we recall in Module 12, is when individuals acting independently and rationally will deplete a shared resource, even when doing so is not to their interest. In this case, the excess emission of the greenhouse gas resources due to human activity. The goal is to place more ownership of carbon emissions on those emitting it, which is essentially everyone: common citizens, business companies, agricultural sectors, and industrial entities, etc. They thus become decision makers. These entities thus become decision makers who will bear the direct impact of such decisions. The initiative 732, as the bill was called, sought to place a $25 per metric ton of CO2 tax in the state of Washington. Let me say that again. It sought to place a $25 per metric ton of CO2 tax in the state of Washington. Unfortunately for advocates of this mitigation strategy, the initiative was defeated by a 59% to 45% vote in Washington State Congress.